Welcome to Comsverse. This session is called Deploying Microsoft Teams for Collaboration in a Global Organization and will be presented by Chirag Patel. Over to you, Chirag.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave. So welcome everyone to Comsverse. As Dave mentioned, my session is about deploying Microsoft Teams and for collaboration in a global organization. Such a mouthful of a title, but it is what it is in terms of my the scenario, a real world scenario that I had worked with that. So let's crack on. Firstly, I'd just like to say thanks to all the sponsors and in particular Microsoft and everybody else. I think without them, obviously this event would not have happened in terms of their funding and everything else. So if you haven't already checked them out, please do so. And so big thanks, and also to Mark Vale and Martin and Randy as well for their hard work and effort to getting the Microsoft Teams environment up and running for this global event. A bit about me, I'm Chirag Patel. I Office and App Services MVP, generally work with Microsoft 365 related tech, long-time SharePoint bloke. Work with various UK partners just to help deliver solutions for their customers. But generally, I just share anything that around Microsoft 365 related and try and keep up with the certifications as well, because things change constantly all the time. In my spare time, if I do get any, then I tend to speak out at a lot of community events. I also organize a user group in the UK, Microsoft 365 UK. And so if you do get time, all my slides, sessions, recordings, everything gets posted, and you can access that from my blog site, techchirag.com. So what we're going to talk about is basically the way to enable and improve collaboration for your organization. So this session is based on my real world scenario that I worked with an organization last year who were on Skype and various other different technologies to try and get onto Microsoft Teams. So what we're really going to cover essentially is in terms of how we rolled out Microsoft Teams in terms of phase-by-phase basis, but also going through some of the planning and governance elements of it as well, together with some of the workshops around it. So hopefully that'll kind of give you the, if you like, it'll give you kind of an enticer around how to kind of roll that out. Now, obviously, every organization is different depending on where they are in their journey. So some of these things may have done, or you may even ignore to follow. Sometimes governance is one of those areas which just doesn't get looked at right from the start, or instead it maybe gets looked at towards the end. So whatever that your requirements or your scenarios are, or the efforts, it will vary, but we'll go through all those things and some of the good practices around that in terms of things to think about. And so obviously the session is targeted for IT as well as for the business managers as well. So not very much technical heavy, but at least there's the benefit for the business managers to share some of the information in this session to their IT folks, and vice versa as well, from the IT to business as well. So depending on the audience for this session here. So the organization that I was based at, it's a very small organization in terms of the number of users, but certainly they were spread across the globe in 10 different countries. So by all means, user base is very small, but challenges roughly are the same for even just as for the larger organization with large user base. And all these company did was basically projects of various types of constructions, engineering, renewable energy based projects. So very much a diverse workforce, and people just doing their own things in their own way, just to basically achieve the desired outcomes for their organization. So in terms of why did they roll out Teams? Now, obviously, they're a small business, but at the same time, they wanted to kind of globalize and have that true kind of definition of being a global organization. And also the way to do that, they and this is reading through their other organizations, their competitors, just to encourage collaboration, increase the efficiency. Now, these are the kind of things that was presented to me by their management, saying that this is why we want to do Microsoft Teams. Depending on who you speak to, not very quantitative way to measure in terms of what is it exactly why you want it, but broadly speaking, qualitatively, these were the kind of the main drivers around why they wanted to roll out. So equally, more work to be done to follow on that project in order to roll out Microsoft Teams, and how is it going to be beneficial to every user in this organization. And then obviously the main one there was basically that, they used a lot of third-party tools, so they wanted to reduce that as well. So in a way, that's a bit of a kind of a scope creep around if you wanted to roll out Teams, and then you have to almost try and analyze what other third-party tools you have and how you're going to replace those things with, say, Microsoft Teams, or even the related tech from Microsoft 365 as well. But roughly those were the kind of the main reasons why Microsoft Teams was rolled out. So in terms of their estate, for the technology-wise, what they had, excuse me, is they had a number of things going on with them. So in kind of a different kind of internal cloud phone system, they were on Skype for Business, using some other vendor solution for their external collaboration, for external calls, different kind of live events, kind of hosting their kind of town hall meetings. Total kind of, if you like, not in a good shape, but those were the kind of various vendors that we're using. Now, they wanted to replace that, but not straight away as part of the Microsoft Teams rollout, but certainly to reduce the usage that their users were using this. So not everybody were into Teams. They used some other technologies like Zoom and all these things. Now, everybody, we know, depending on how you kind of have your strategy, whether you're going to be all Microsoft house or whether you're going to use the best of the other tools. So they had challenges around how best to go through those, replacing those third-party tools. And so when you look at that, and especially with the Microsoft Teams side of things, then the very first thing for them to understand is that we want to do Teams because everybody's doing it, and that's fine, that's great. But what you have with Microsoft Teams does not mean that everything is stored in there, because there's a huge number of services that depend on Microsoft Teams. And especially with one of the key elements for this organization is they in fact left SharePoint to go with another provider to store their documents. And then on one hand, they wanted to roll out Teams. So it was like a question of, okay, well, if you're going to roll out Teams and you're going to have file collaboration happening, then for sure you're going to use SharePoint. So therefore you end up having two kind of document management type systems, one for the collaboration purposes to use SharePoint, and then you have this other system for your document management. So that was a bit of a surprise for this organization to learn that we've just gone away from SharePoint and now we're going to come back. So they came back with SharePoint, but to separate it purely from a project's collaboration perspective. And for everything else, they would use their document management system that they had. So there was a clear process to separate for the users. Needless to say, there was no automation, there was no workflows around it to be able to lift the documents from your Microsoft Teams to put it into this other third-party system. So that was challenge number one for the users, to be able to manually move their documents, if it's in a final version of that docs, into this third-party system. And then of course you got the having your group chats and the files you share within your group chats resides in OneDrive, and anything that you create within your Microsoft Teams resides in your SharePoint main document library within the folder channels. So finding, uncovering some of these kind of, if you like, all the different elements to this part of the work, then naturally for me, as part of the project team here, was to understand their landscape, because they had rolled out SharePoint. They already had 2 million files in them. No real governance around it in terms of who's looking after what, whether there were duplicates. And before we enrolled out, there were 100 Microsoft Teams. pretty much anybody could create these teams, so there was no real provisioning controls or of any kind. So that was there, and also anybody could create teams, so no real naming conventions. I think you get the idea that there was no real structure around this. But the next step for me was really to kind of document in terms of the health check and the configuration for not just Microsoft Teams, but other areas of Microsoft 365 as well. So that's the SharePoint, Yammer, and everything else, because they had switched it on everything for that. And this particular exercise, not everything is done through PowerShell scripts. Some of it is manual to go through the admin centers for various effort that's involved around this to be able to capture this kind of information. And so once we had that information, then it was more about educating the organization to how to roll out. Now, they said they wanted to encourage collaboration. And if you look at it from a collaboration perspective, and this is obviously the Microsoft's guidance as to how you go about rolling out, you could do all 4 phases of this to roll that out. But given the amount of change and the third-party tools they have, it was naturally to just go and with the Teams itself and not really bother too much from the meetings and the voice element side of things. So it was a case of understanding their existing Microsoft Teams, but also at the same time to kind of just understand through the use of surveys and to understand what they like about Teams and what they don't like about Teams, and so that the effort can be focused more on what is it that they didn't like about the Teams. Then on the back of this, the strategy was created. We gave the program an identity and literally just kind of, if you like, just no more than 2-page to put it down in a 5-phase plan as to what's going to get rolled out. So pretty much phase 1 was the discovery part of it, doing the health check, everything else. But also phase 2 was more about the collaboration aspect of it and rolling out Teams as well as other elements of it. So we'll look at that plan a bit later on. But first off, it was basically to deliver IT training for Microsoft Teams. In other organizations, sometimes IT guys are left to the last and then get them trained. So in this case, it was important for them to be able to have that training early on, given that they were a very small team as well. From a user perspective, instead of kind of bombarding them with everything about Teams, it was fundamentally to understand that where your conversations happen, because one of the feedback we had with their existing use of Teams was it's too disruptive, it's too chatty, and no real kind of management around it. And that's, in a way, that's what Teams does, because it's organic. You know, it is going to happen. You know, there's no real boundaries around it that you can prevent from that. You can probably control your channel notifications and all those things, but typically 5 areas is the way we kind of help them to understand that, you know, you can have your private chats, you know, to one-to-ones and everything else. You got your group chats, which you can create from with anybody, add people to it, give a name, and you got yourself an ad hoc group chat. And it was kind of really interesting around that, because there were a lot of group chats and very less teams, and a lot of the files were residing in those group chats. And to that effect, OneDrive was very significant for them to understand that a lot of their files were residing in the OneDrive around their group chats. But then obviously you got your team chats as well. So that's kind of in your channels, which is backed by the SharePoint site. And then obviously you've got your tab conversations. So depending on what tabs you've kind of put on, then obviously there's conversations that happen at the tab level as well. And then the 5th one, which is the one that really gets most people, is the file-based conversations. And when you look at the file conversations, even though you've kind of, you know, put a tab for a particular file, then any conversations you record there, they're not going to be saved in the file unless you choose the comments inside your Word or Excel. So that was a way kind of we separated out from a collaboration perspective. The first point, your modes of conversations that you're going to have in order to basically just be more productive. When you look at the phase plan, because the team that we were in, there was no project manager, there was no architect, there was no trainer, very small IT team, and I was the only resource for them from a Microsoft 365 perspective to roll out Teams. So by all means, I'm not a project manager, but I do some elements of it. And Microsoft have put really good guides. At the end of the session, you'll find all the links to all these materials. But for us, it was basically being able to adapt the plan around this, but also adopt it to the way that's going to work for us. Now, this is kind of, if you like, the kind of a very high level way of rolling it out in phases. And based on our phases, we obviously decided on picking up 1 or 2 business applications in order to make it more successful to integrate with the Microsoft Teams. And then obviously focus on the rolling out and then migration aspects of it, which was from Skype for Business and not so much from the old third-party system for document management, so purely from Skype migration. And then when we looked at it from the phase 1 perspective, although it says 0 to 1 month for this organization with little amount of resource, it was obviously a question of more than like 2 or 3 months for us, purely because just no real project management resources, and the decision making was somewhat little slow to kind of make this work in the first instance. But once that was kind of done, then it was kind of more understanding, what apps, what kind of elements they're going to be are the ones that's going to really get more impact for all the users. So that's kind of what we use from this particular project plan perspective in order to get them across to Teams. And especially they also had Skype and Microsoft Teams together as well. So we'll talk about that a bit later on that one as well. So from a journey perspective, from an IT journey to the end user journey. So obviously IT is always going to be the first to get onto the Teams at the same time, understanding the differences and everything else. But looking at from this perspective, collaboration from an external collaboration perspective, that was just basically enabled from day one, but on the basis that only selective projects get access to it, to your other third-party partner companies. But from a user perspective, yes, chats was there and everything else, but also taking advantage of some of the distribution lists and more around educating them that your common distribution list you have can be migrated into actual Teams itself. They didn't go for that particular aspect to begin with, but once they realized they got Teams for every kind of department, for every project, then they realized the duplications happening between the distribution list that they have, which they use for their comms, versus the actual Teams that they had itself. So that kind of became very gradual progress to lose one by one all those distribution lists in exchange to have the dedicated Teams for that. So that's kind of a journey kind of guidance around how kind of to move forward all the way to that you lose out Skype for Business altogether and end up with just Teams only mode, and for all the users being only on that Teams mode. So in terms of planning sessions, you can have few or you can have too many, really dependent in our case as to how much buy-in we're going to get from the users, especially their day-to-day jobs is purely to work around the projects and everything else. So when we looked at that, then obviously the key area for us was from the training and adoption perspective, but also covering off other areas of security, compliance, and governance and everything else. So it was more of a, which way around are we going to do this? So for us, it was more to say that, look, if you're going to have this adopted and you want to get your globalization, everything else all done, then you need to really understand from the user's perspective how best to get them on training. Now, they were not sent on any training. There were no real training programs. But what was put in place is the Champions Network in order for them to actually go and inform their teams respectively in that way. So other organizations do it in a different way and they have probably more resource and structured around it. For us, it was basically to go with that approach and then be able to use all the team's resources that we have and also the scheduled training as well, which Microsoft provide on a regular basis for that as well. So governance and the security compliance we'll cover in slightly more detail, but for the rest, it was more from an infrastructure perspective that if you're not going to assess your network, then that's one big risk you're going to have, depending on how slow or fast it is based on your network capability as well. But network planning tool is what you get in your teams, and that's the way we kind of started that off. So building the champions network, we kind of established 20 champions across the 10 countries. And really, it was kind of the idea was there to basically be able to help understand the teams and everything else that goes around it, but also being able to set up a team workspace for them and then being able to use that. And that's naturally with any product that you would do. But in our case, it was more from me like leading the champion network, but also kind of advising them on how best to kind of keep involved with the business to understand what kind of requirements you have, what kind of daily work scenarios you have, all those kind of things, and being able to store all that information in that team. So that way they were kind of using Teams from that perspective. The champions that they were there, they were obviously mixed roles. So obviously some of them were testers, but they were kind of made into champions. So for them, as having that concept was very new because they've never used that kind of network in their other systems, but they really like that concept around the fact that you got champions and being able to kind of go with that. No real rewards for them because there was no budget around it. But I think in my view, champions should be rewarded and definitely be sent to kind of formal training programs as well for them to be able to train completely on that. Fortunately, they didn't have that capacity, so I had to train them on Microsoft Teams around that. So that kind of worked for them and being able to take that further with their business units on that. When you look at the team side of things, which was like another area of confusion around, okay, so once they got educated around, okay, it's the SharePoint side behind it, it creates a Microsoft 365 group, it's got its own email, everything else. So what do we call that? You know, what's the terminology we're going to use? And that's the very first thing to kind of really understand and sort that out. So for us, it was more like to say, well, look, we're going to call it Teams Workspace. Whether you like SharePoint side or Teams, doesn't really matter. That's what you will get. And as part of that workspace, this is what you're going to get: team files, notebook, planner. So essentially the same components you get in your Microsoft 365 suite, but kind of labeling in such a way that it kind of gives them the descriptors for each of those components. They might not use it, and that's fine. Things like, say, planner, not every team will have the use for the planner plan, but at least they know it's there. And that's how we kind of, if you like, packaged it up to say that this is what you're going to get. And then obviously start kind of using for their needs. The kind of suggestions we came up with, again, if you look at this kind of guidance available from Microsoft side, you can name your teams in such a way. So by applying those kind of policies in your Azure AD, then you can actually have those naming conventions in that place. We kind of just went for very simple ways because projects is pretty much what they did, but also like creating some of the business functions team spaces as well. So we kind of just went with that option of having, you know, for a department name, the team, project, and just kind of separate that out. And then any ad hoc initiatives or topics we get, then we would consider that to be based on the location that we get. So kind of a lot of it was projects, but obviously the way to understand was that with which location that project was based on. Because if we called everything as project, then when you look at in your team's kind of chat workspace, then everything's going to begin with P. Yes, you can search and get to your project's team space, but for them was more like to understand the view of the file that they get. Excuse me. The type of teams that we had for in terms of the project wise were development teams, construction, and joint ventures. So, and then obviously there were other related, but those were the main project kind of, if you like, the scenarios perspective of what was going to really win Microsoft Teams for this organization. So when we looked at the development and construction particularly, that was the time that was heavily spent just to understand how that project works, what kind of team, what kind of channels they wanted. So we kind of went through that just in a very simple workshop just to understand who do they liaise with, which team members in the organization they work with. We let them create that channel, gave them for about, if you like, 4 weeks to work with that model of that team workspace. They refined it, gave us the feedback. Then obviously we kind of refined it further. And then we just took the template of that development project team. And then for every project that we're creating, we were just using that as a template. And the good thing about that was that we and IT didn't really defined that. It was the business owner. So we held that person accountable to say that that's the template owner for that project. And so any changes will have to go through that person and the body that represents that development project. So kind of very simple way to go with that, but also on the portfolio side of things as well, how to have various projects within that. We didn't use project online because to an extent that was considered as a candidate option, but from a licensing perspective, that was not deemed for early phase. So something for the future if they do consider that area. Kind of very quick one on this one is the kind of quick scenarios as to why would you use Teams versus some of the users who were using WhatsApp and everything else. So kind of just put this together, kind of a snippet of this in terms of if you're working with files, then you obviously want to post your, say, the agenda, like an Excel file, however you use it. We kind of looked at those kind of things ways to understand how to best reduce that kind of information. If they're having a lot of meetings, then using the OneNote meetings, because like some of the organizations, they love their emails, their Word documents, or even just any of the tools. So OneNote, they were not using that much, but they started using it, and some projects they were not using that at all. So it was a question of, the tools are there, and what works for you doesn't mean that it doesn't work for anybody else. So that the kind of the choice they had was around that. And then obviously using Word, PowerPoint manuals instead of, using Stream instead of Word or PowerPoint videos for that. So a number of ways of doing it, but kind of we just went that through department by department, business by business, to kind of come up with at least 4 or 5 scenarios so that they know exactly what they're aiming for. Governance, I think this, even though it's in the middle of the presentation, but this really should be done at the beginning of any part of the project. Now, this is kind of just a snapshot around the governance side of things through the health check that I did, kind of picking all the configuration elements of it. And really, you can do this in a number of ways. I know Susan Hanley has got a huge resource around the governance aspects of it. You can have a dedicated SharePoint site for it. For these folks here, document was something that's just going to work for them. So kind of just went through all those topics as to how best your information is going to be placed, who's going to look after which teams, and all the other areas items that you get in there. The main thing is that it was the user system, so they should be really the owners for it. IT was not really the owner as such, so that was a good part, because in some organizations IT owns it, and then they basically have to pick up all the pieces around it. So in this case, it was the business who's also driving that. So from a file collaboration perspective, very simple messaging, OneDrive for your personal files, Teams for where you do all your work. Obviously, OneDrive and SharePoint would be your content collaboration. But because for this organization, third-party tool that they were using, this had to be ingrained for them to understand that not everything has to live in the Teams, because once you end up with the final version of those files, they have to be put across in the knowledge repository. And that's how they were kind of left to deal with, to understand how the documents are going to flow from one system to another. At the time when we were working with this system, there were some integration tools coming on board with Microsoft Teams. So that was something that was going to be explored to make that process easier for the users to simply just switch push the documents from Teams into the knowledge repository. The security and compliance is like with any organization I've seen some organizations treating this actual security compliance as a separate phase of the project. Clearly, it needs to be part of the actual existing project that you work with, and yeah, IT is at the center of it, but they don't really have to own and govern anything around that, and if the business doesn't really own that. So the way kind of went about this is clearly the owner who has to own this, the security, the legal teams. Now in this organization, they didn't have all the teams, the legal team, but no information security officer. IT were actually the gatekeepers for it. So straight away, that was just a big risk to begin with. in terms of when you're going to put your information, no classification, no labeling, and everything else. So the kind of, if you like, informing the activity around the impacts around that was put in place, but that was done by through the use of the policies. So these are the kind of policies in a plain English, just with for both business and IT, that from an IT perspective, they have the how to enable those policies. So pretty much looking at from an identity, devices, information, and the app security side of things. So this was put forward to them to say, well, if you don't do your policies, then this is what you stand to lose or risk for your organizations, including your devices if they're using personal devices. So obviously that kind of comes into traction, and obviously picking up some of those policies to begin with, and then going forward with all the rest of the policies. So not everything was implemented, especially things like those sensitivity labels and retention labels. But I think they're, especially with sensitivity labels, they've kind of come in a general release recently. Then obviously for the organization, they had to pick on that. And the link that you have on that slide, this is the one for the business decision makers. Clear Excel spreadsheet that basically states what actions they need to take in order to implement those policies there. So very helpful for them to be able to put a plan together to kind of drive that forward in order to put that in place. The external collaboration sharing, this was, this is kind of confusing for some organizations, especially when you got, the tenant level switch, you got the Microsoft 365 groups guest access versus SharePoint, which has its own invitation model as well. So it was kind of really to, if you like, to put that in perspective as to what's going to be shared. Now, this is obviously just a screenshot for that, but OneDrive was not meant to be shared externally. SharePoint is, so it kind of gives them an idea around what controls they have to kind of release that for external sharing. And then obviously for the groups, especially by default, because they're enabled for guest access, then they would have to go around a particular group for that project to disable guest access completely if that is not going to be available for external users. And that was done through the PowerShell scripts for that. So in terms of kind of the workshops for the departments, the workshops we did for the departments, kind of a set flow, if you like, as to how you go about doing that. So firstly, ready the session pack for this. So again, using the actual use case for a particular department for the development project, and in terms of how they did it for their teams, and inviting them into this workshop as well. So we had to rely on that source just purely from their perspective to be able to advise their peers as to what's worked for them and why we should do it. So IT never went alone to deliver these workshops. Do the demos, then obviously follow up in a space of 4 days, 4 or 5 days, just to understand the homework that they got, which was essentially what kind of content they work with, who they work with, and what sort of things would they want to see in that teams, just as a starter, and then be able to gradually build that team workspace for them, about designing and everything else, and then hand it over to them to be able to run with that team's workspace and follow up in a kind of 4 weeks time to see what's the results of that team. So with that, obviously that was a very quick way of kind of doing that for that workshop, but that's the only way we could go around for all the projects and the functions and the departments in order to roll that teams out altogether. This was just a couple of examples I've got here. So, in terms of using the group's calendar, so not so much of the individual team calendar, if you like. So using the SharePoint page, we can actually bring the group's calendar into as a SharePoint page, as a web part, and then surface that into Microsoft Teams. So that was kind of, if you like, the first step in order to show them demo that they can do that without having to go into the group's calendar itself and be able to kind of attend those meetings from that particular meeting calendar there. And for the project status updates, we started using the SharePoint news. So for every project, we post their update and they get their updates in that manner. Just a way to kind of, if you like, entice for that SharePoint side inside their teams for it. So that was kind of a kind of template tabs we had for every project that we kind of created for that. And then in terms of provisioning the teams, it was a straightforward IT help desk scenario in terms of getting the request for the new teams, kind of just understand what the team's going to be about, how long is it going to be, they're going to need it for, the usual governance related questions, and then up to the point where it's approved not just by IT, but from the business and the champions as well, so that they know exactly where the team is going to go. And then we would just provision that team through the use of PowerShell script in that template based. We did look at some of the third-party tools to provision the teams, as well as the governance tools. And because with the cost as well as the effort of creating some of these teams, and we were not talking about creating so many teams in short space of time, so we didn't really go with that. But governance tool was under consideration in order to how to govern the platform and not just the provisioning of the teams itself. And then obviously just train them on the teams, the basic features around Microsoft Teams, as well as some of the use cases of the organization to get the idea of the teams for them to, for their departments. Because we didn't have a training department, all trainers for it, and this is a huge kind of valuable resource from Microsoft, the custom learning solution that you can simply just download it from the Microsoft site, and it's just a SharePoint site that you get in your environment. And the good thing we liked about this is that you get that up-to-date content from Microsoft delivered right inside your SharePoint site. So we customized it quite a lot. I say customize, not any coding, but kind of with all the layouts, and also started putting other third-party tools information on this site as well, and kind of really making that one-stop shop to go to kind of not just learn about Teams, but also other areas of the services as well. And then obviously running the workshops that we had, some of the kind of the webinars, and they were all kind of run from this SharePoint site as well. So it was the place to go and book for their sessions, and also being able to kind of get their checklist of what to do to get started with Teams and everything else. And then in terms of the comms plan activities, again, I'm not a change manager, but obviously in terms of going through that, using all the materials we get from Microsoft, we were using all the email templates. We obviously tailored it to our requirements, but it was more of because there was a small number of users, so we just kind of really gone with the approach of giving like just 2 weeks notice, and then 1 week, and then everybody just were switched over from onto Teams itself to kind of formalize the go live moment, if you like. And whilst everybody were on Teams before anyway, so it wasn't much of a kind of a big change for them, but it was more of like switching the Skype off, which we'll just look at that quickly in a second as well. And then for every knowledge-based event sessions that we carried out, that's the kind of format we followed. We grabbed the user, the business user, their story and the demo for their solution, and kind of just repeat that session in that week 3 times for different parts of the countries, and then followed by a intranet news article. So it was kind of a way to kind of have that knowledge-based event session for that after the events, the Teams was live. Skype for Teams upgrade, it wasn't really a complex for us because we didn't really use any calling plans or anything like that. Again, this is from Microsoft side itself that we used, and basically just used over days. We obviously took out some of those activities from that, but for reference, this is quite good to kind of go through that how to go from Skype for Business to your Teams if you're already using that, and especially when that's coming to retirement sooner. So we kind of went with that approach, and again, it's a very straightforward plan to kind of switch over to that. Obviously, if you are on calling plans and everything else, then that plan will look totally different and will be complex. But the idea was to end up with the all Teams mode altogether. Notification wise, as it says on the tin there, that's exactly how it happened. They were obviously informed that you're going to get notifications, and they got it. They followed the instructions, and no issues there at all from Skype to Teams. And then they were all kind of into the Teams only mode, so they had the full experience of Microsoft Teams, and the Skype buttons just disappeared from their Outlook altogether. So that was kind of very straightforward for them. Number of ways to measure the success as to how this kind of happened to there. Again, there's the adoption pack you get with the Power BI, everything else. For this, for us, it was a question of, are we having any activities? No real quality measurement around it, but the trend certainly was upwards. And this was obviously up to about kind of January, February time of this year. But since then, obviously, COVID-19 situations occurred, so very hard to measure because everyone's working from home, and so their stats have gone up really high up, purely because you're working from home and they need that tools. So they were kind of very lucky as an organization that they rolled out their teams way before when this COVID-19 happened. So they were actually more beneficial to use teams from that perspective there. So then the next part was more around how to handle the feature request, because the features started coming, the request started to come along, and then obviously we had to put this in place because part of the challenge for the IT is that they, with limited IT using all the other resources to manage their other systems, the process was not really in place. That once you've rolled out Teams, and also to that effect with Microsoft 365, how are you going to handle those requests? So question of get the requirement, review it. If it's a large requirement, then obviously you may have to go through the business case. If not, then obviously you can just review those options and then decide how you're going to do that. So whether you're going to use 365 or some third-party tools. And then from a roadmap perspective, we put that together just to understand where you want to progress your journey further, because collaboration was the start of it. And then obviously we rolled out Yammer. So that was kind of, again, in the last few months, that happened just while the COVID-19 situation, just to bring everybody together. So part of it, part of the challenge there was the Yammer was just purely for company-wide conversations and not to be mixed with Microsoft Teams at all. And then obviously the next steps was most to around that, we don't want IT to have the request every time, but really give the control over to the champions and being able to then decide to provision the teams for the users as they get. And then obviously intranets and forms and power apps, all those things were put into consideration for their future roadmap, if you like, as to rolling out and really getting the best out of the Microsoft 365 environment. Okay, so with that, I mean, that's pretty, that's obviously a lot of slides, a lot of materials to go through, and this slides will be shared afterwards. But here's the resources that I used, and these are constantly changing. But if you're thinking of rolling out Teams in some way, and some of the organizations have really speeded up in doing that, and probably may not even realize the SharePoint bits behind it and everything else. But all the materials you'll find is all there, all the templates, everything else. So do take a look at that. And with that, I'll just say thanks to everyone. And any questions, anything like that, feel free to drop me on that site. But obviously, I'll look towards Dave now and see if there's any questions. But yeah, just want to say thanks to everybody, Comsverse, and Dave as well for helping to produce this session. So thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thanks, Chirag. I think we're probably pretty much at time, to be honest. So I think that's probably all the time we've got for the session. So if you want to chat with Chirag following the session, then you can find him in the breakout area.
Yeah, I'll be there.
So I'm just popping something in the announcements, but doesn't. Apologies if I've published this a number of times, but it doesn't seem to be there. Are you seeing that, Chirag? The goteams.fans/BRK244. If it's not there, not quite sure what's happened to my my team's there. It's gone a bit funny.
That's all right. Let me put that. Cool. I've got it here.
Perfect.
Okay. So, yeah, that's great.
Catch up with Chirag. Yeah, goteams.fans/BRK244. Thanks for a great session. And yeah, hope everybody has a pleasant afternoon, evening, wherever you are.
Great. Thanks.
Cheers.